Okay, so finally the day has come when I'm going to start laying tiles. Been looking forward to this for a long time. So, what have I done already to lead up to this point? Well, the concrete slab needed to be acid etched so that it would provide a good bondable surface. So yesterday I mixed a 10:1 ratio of acid and water, hydrochloric acid, and put that around on the concrete slab, allowed it to etch the surface, create a rougher surface, and that way it makes a better surface for the tile glue to stick to. So I've allowed it to do its job for about 5 to 10 minutes, and then I washed it off. After washing off the acid etching, I then primed it with a floor primer for tiling over. What the primer does, it actually locks in any particles, any loose dust, so that when we glue the tiles on, it's got a firm hold onto the surface rather than being onto dust and not being bonded very well. So that prepared the slab. Now that brings me to the stage where I've got to consider how to set out where to start laying the tiles, where to put full tiles, where to put the cuts. So what do we do? What do we look at that's important to take into consideration? Well, this is how I do it. I look at what is going to be most noticeable when you walk into a home. So this is the front door here, and as you walk in the front door, there's a main wall on the left there, but there's also going to be a dining room table that's sitting there, but our focus of the person walking through the door is probably more likely to be on this wall along here. Now, bear in mind, these cupboards are all going to go, and so we're going to be left with a wall at this level. So all those cupboards are going, so this is going to be a main wall that's going to be seen as soon as you walk in. So I'm sort of thinking that we want to have a full tile or a large cuts along there rather than end up with little skinny cuts along there. That's not going to look good. We want to, any little cuts we've got, we want to try and put them in an inconspicuous place. So I'm thinking full tiles or large cuts along that wall. We've also got a couple of other things to think about. So that's that way. What about this way? Where would we run full tiles? Well, one consideration that I've got is what happens at the doorway. So I'm just going to grab a tile and lay it in the doorway and see where the joints running this way, how they work with these other walls. So we've got these tiles, 590mm by 590mm. So we'll lay that down here. Now what I'm doing, obviously it's sitting on an angle, this is just a temporary piece of timber here. This tile, the front tile edge, is going to overhang the door step, because there'll be some of this tile I'll cut to go along the face of the door step there. So this will be roughly where the tile goes. Allow it to overhang the width, the thickness of a tile plus glue. So let's just sit that there for now and see where this join lines up. So, grab another tile. So at this stage we're not worried about this way, we're just working out where our joints run this way so that they'll work best for the other walls. So give it about 2 to 3 mil joint. Okay, now that's going to be roughly about where they go if we're to start with a full tile at the door. What will that mean for up here? Well, add a couple more tiles on. The other thing you can do is run a laser light along to give you a straight line and know where they're going to come up, where they're going to get to. But this is just as effective. And then one here. Now, this will start to tell us what this is going to do with this wall, where these joints will go. Okay, add this one in here. So remember, at this stage we're just working out where these joints will run and how they'll work with the wall. Now you'll notice there's some skirting board on here. That's going to have to be removed. And look, when you're tiling, I try and make sure I remove, if I can possibly, remove all the skirting board. It allows you to run the tiles under and have an expansion joint running around the perimeter, which means less likelihood of having to run an expansion joint in the middle of a floor. I think inside internal applications, the expansion joints should be put around about 8 meters, every 8 meters, because that allows for expansion, contraction, especially if there's sun on your floor. But we'll get away with very minimal expansion joints running through the main tiles, because I'll run it around the edge. So the skirting board will have to come off. Now, remember, running a full tile at the door has ended up with our tiles joint running along here, which means very skinny little cuts. Not going to look very good, because this is the lounge here, and the lounge will be sitting around here. That's going to be a main wall along there, and you're going to see lots of little small cuts along there. Better if they can be larger cuts or a full tile. So far, what have we understood about this layout? Well, starting with full tiles at the door isn't really going to work really well with that wall there. So let's just see what we can do to improve this. So the current layout of the tiles doesn't really work for that wall, so that was putting a full tile at the doorway means the joints don't work for that wall, means we're left with little cuts along the wall. So I'm going to reposition them, but before I do that I'm just going to remove this skirting board that's existing there. So I'll just get some tools. So I've got a hammer and a little bit of a nail wrench. Always bend the nails over straight away in case someone stands on them. Those two pieces and just remove this tile so I don't damage it. Move this out of the way. Okay. Now let's position these tiles, try something different. Now I'm thinking this is a focal point as well. So what might look really good is to have the tiles run evenly up both sides of this post. So these are feature posts here. This was an existing post. There wasn't a post here, but I built a wall up to this post and I cut a doorway in here and I've made a fake post so that it's pleasing to the eye. So I'm figuring that if I move this tile joint over somewhat so that these tiles run evenly a cut either side of the wall the same width, and that'll look good when you walk in. But let's just see how that would work with the front door. So we've got these just roughly even distance either side of the wall. So that gives us a joint that is looking like it's going to work out with the front door, but we'll just double check. I'll show you what I mean by placing them in the position. Okay, so that now gives us a nice large cut in the doorway. That gives us a sufficient tile to be able to overhang the front step to accommodate the vertical tile glued on the face. So that's going to work at the door, and it's also going to work for that wall, so that's a good outcome. So that's helped me decide on where to lay the tiles along this plane. Now the next thing is to work out where to lay the tiles this way so that we get the best placement of tiles so they look good when you walk in. So to work through that, we've got a wall running along here, and we've got the other wall that's running along here. And remember, this is the wall that's going to run all the way through to the kitchen, because all of these cupboards are going, so I need to work off this wall. So I'm sort of thinking, as I mentioned before, that when you walk in the front door here, first thing I do is look across in that direction at that wall. So I'm thinking we need to consider having large tiles or large cuts or full tiles along that wall. So let's try all that and see what that works out like. So this laying out of the tiles is great if you're a visual person. You can see where the joints go. But I'm going to show you a different way based on measuring. It's easier, you don't have to be laying the tiles everywhere, and it's quicker. So now we need to look at where to lay the tiles this way. We've done the joints that way, we know where to lay them that way. We need to work out where the joints should run this way. So we've got this main wall here and the main wall on that side. Question is, do we run full tiles along there or full tiles along here, or cuts both sides? What's the best way to go? Well, this wall will measure from there to the other wall, and I'll explain it as we go. So let's work out what the distance is. Okay, so that's 3 meters 500 millimeters. So the first thing I'm going to do is write down the distance between the walls. Distance is 3 meters 500 millimeters, or 3,500 millimeters. Now the next thing we do is measure the tile and allow for a grout joint. Remember, every tile comes with one grout joint that we've got to allow room for. So let's measure the tile. We know they're 590 millimeters. With a grout joint, 590 millimeters plus 3 means the distance we allow for each tile is 593. So the tiles are 593 millimeters. Now, it's a simple process of getting the distance of 3,500 millimeters divided by the width of the tile plus a grout joint, and we'll do that now. Okay, so 3,500 divided by 593 equals, you see that's 5.9. Now that 5.9 is the number of tiles that will fit in that 3 meters 500. So we've got 5.9 tiles to fit in that space. So the distance, 3,500 millimeters, or 3.5 meters. The actual tiles that we're fitting into that space is 593 millimeters. That's the width of a tile plus one grout joint. Divide that distance by the width of the tile, and it'll fit 5 whole tiles plus 0.9 of a tile. We need to know now what is the measurement of a 0.9 of a tile. So it's almost a whole tile because it's nearly a whole one, but it's 0.9. So the next thing we do is go 0.9 times 593 equals, so we'll do that on the calculator. Okay, so we've got 0.9 times 593 equals 533.7. So round that off to 534. So that's 534 millimeters for each cut. So what have we learned? So why do I bother to do this last calculation? Because we know it's going to be a large cut. 534 millimeters is a big cut. Well, it tells me how much of a tile I've got to play with in case this wall is out. I'll explain. So 593 is the distance, the width of a tile, minus 534. So if I was a whiz-bang mathematician, I'd be able to tell you, but we'll do it by calculation. 593 minus 534 equals 59 millimeters. So we've got almost 60 millimeters to play with. So why is that important? Well, this wall running along here has the cupboards existing on it at the moment. So I don't really know whether this wall, and I have no real clear way of finding out whether this wall stays parallel to that wall. If it was to be parallel to that wall, the distance would remain the same at that end as well as this end, and it wouldn't be an issue. I'll just make the same cuts and lay them, be fine. But if this wall was to get wider at that end, and believe me, this house is a bit like that. You can't be sure that the walls are square. So why do this last calculation? Well, it tells me how much meat I've got left in the tile to accommodate this wall if it's out. So the width of a tile, 590, less the cut, 534, leaves me with 59 millimeters which is a good sized chunk to allow for cutting bigger tiles, bigger cuts to accommodate the wall if it's out. So this is really important whether you're doing old work or new work even, to know whether your walls are parallel to one another and to know whether they're at 90 degrees to one another, so that you know whether you need to have meat in your cuts in order to accommodate the walls if they're out. So we've established full tiles along the far wall, nice wide cuts along this wall. So now we know where the joints are running this way as well as where the joints are running this way. So just a couple of things I just want to check now. With running full tiles from that wall, where will we end up at that doorway? What size cut will be at the doorway? We don't want a little tiny cut at the door. The other one is running, we established to run even tiles even width on either side of this wall. Where will that end up on the far wall? What size cuts there? So let's work this one first. I'll do a full measurement again of the distance between both walls. So I'm going to measure until just under the doorway, which will be 5 meters 850, 5850. Okay, well, so what I'll do now is write 5850 is the distance between both walls. So that's 5 meters 850 millimeters. Now I divide 5,850 by 593 and we'll find out what that is. $58.50 divided by 593 equals 9.86. Okay, so that gives us 9 full tiles plus 0.8 or 0.9 of a tile. So 0.9 is almost a whole tile at that doorway. So that's sorted. That's great. That's good news. And we just want to check what the cut size will be at the far wall over there. So I'm going to measure this distance like we've done before. It's actually 4 meters 400 exactly. 4 meters 400. So we've got the distance is 4 meters 400. So that's 4,400 millimeters. So we go 4,400 millimeters divided by 593 equals 4,400. Get the calculator going again. 4,400 divided by 593 equals 7.4. So that's 7.4 tiles, 7 whole tiles and 0.4 of a tile. So when you think of 0.4, that's almost 0.5, so that's almost half a tile. So that's great news. We'll have almost half a tile running along this wall here. So we've established we've got no tiny little cuts. on the main walls. So that's really good news. And that means now that I can pull a chalk line and establish exactly where I start. Okay, so yeah, happy chappy. So now I need to pull the chalk lines where it'll give me a clear indication of where I can start tiling. So to do that, I know full tiles are running along that wall, so I'm going to put 2 tiles out from the wall, and that'll give me this where the line comes through there. So I'll do that first, and just watch me through the process. I'm going to have to run 3 tiles because it's not quite going to get past this wall post here. Okay, so I'm going to do the same in the back there, because what I want to do is measure the same distance of 3 tiles, and then I'll pull a chalk line along the edge of both these sets of tiles, and that'll give me a line all the way out through the room there, and that'll establish that that line is parallel to that wall. Let's sneak in behind here, in between the table and the kitchen bench. Another tile. And a 3rd tile. Then I have to shift the fridge so we can pull a string line through. Okay, so I'm going to roll this fridge out the way. Then we have to carefully move our nice monstera plant. Okay, so now I can get the chalk line, and what do I do with that? Here we go. So all it is a string line with chalk attached to it. So this is where I need to put some weight down to hold the chalk line in place. So I might just try hooking it on the edge of the tile. So that might just do the trick actually. We'll just put some weight on the tile. This will become quite clear what we do here. Keep a tension on it. Now, I'm going to need to just adjust that tile so that I get the, just make a few tweaks with this. So that's still on a bit of an angle there. So here the chalk line is showing that the wall is out. I've put a red line along where the chalk line is, which shows very clearly the wall is out by at least 5 millimeters in a distance of half a meter. I've laid a straight edge along this wall to see whether it's straight or not. And as you'll see very clearly, the wall is bowed right out. Now this is hard up against the wall, and it shows that the wall is bowed right out. Now I'm not too concerned about that because I will lay the tiles out to accommodate for that gap, and that'll be covered by the skirting board. As you can see, there's a lot of tiling already been done. Unfortunately, we lost a lot of footage, and so that's why I'm going to walk you through now the setting out of the tiling. So I flicked my chalk line parallel to the dining room wall, and then I flicked a second chalk line that was exactly 90-degree angles to that chalk line, running along this way. Now you might ask, how could I make sure the two chalk lines were exactly 90-degree angles? Well, that's using the 3-4-5 rule, which I'll explain in a few moments. So this chalk line, which was at 90-degree angles to that chalk line, I measured from the chalk line to the wall, along the wall here, and it showed very clearly that this wall was not parallel to this chalk line, which meant that this wall was not at 90-degree angles to the dining room. So then I was faced with what to do with the different size cuts along one wall. Well, I knew that this wall along here in the dining and the kitchen rooms was the focal point. So everything had to look right along there. So what I did was I decided to put the cuts that were going to be out of square slightly, because this wall's not square to that wall. I put them here. And being a large cut, it was not so noticeable. And the fact too was that the furniture was going to sit along here and hide it. So coming up next, I'm going to explain the 3-4-5 rule. Now there is a short on this, but there's a lot more detail in the next segment. So here we are looking out over the valley. I just thought I'd take a few minutes to explain to you how to make sure large areas are square. Easy way to do it. Now it's easy enough if you're wanting to make sure something small is square, say 40 centimeters, 400 millimeters. You can just use a hand square to check that it's square. But what about if you're measuring out to lay tiles, or you're measuring to the slab of a floor that you want to pour and you want to make sure it's exactly square? Well, that's really easy. You just use the 3-4-5 rule. The 3-4-5 rule involves measuring 3 units of length, 4 units of length, and then connecting the two end points, the diagonal, should be 5 units of length. So for example, if you wanted to make sure 2 walls that intersect are square to one another, then you would measure from the corner of where they intersect 3 meters, then you go back to the corner, measure 4 meters along the other wall, and the diagonal, the distance of the diagonal of those 2 points should be 5 meters. 3, 4, 5. And if they come in at the meetup, the 5 meter length, then that's square. I'll explain it a bit better on paper for you if you like. I'm going to show you on paper how simple this 3-4-5 rule is. It involves measuring 3 units along one wall, 4 units of measurement along the next wall, at 90-degree angles, or you want to check those 90-degree angles. And then you measure the diagonal should be 5 units of length. So let's illustrate this on with this square. So this square is 90-degree angle, and we'll make a point there and we'll measure 3 units. So let's say 3 lots of 50 mil. So that'll be 150. So that'll be the 3 units of measure there. So 3 lots of 50 mil is 150 mil. Now we go 4 lots of 50, and that'll be 200. So 4 lots of 50 mil, we're using the unit measure of 50 mil. Now we can take that off. We know it's square because of the square. But now these 2 points, the diagonals, should measure 5 lots of 50 mil. So 5 5s are 25, 250 mil this should be. And if we measure that along there, I'll just put it there so you can see it. And it is 250 mil. So that measurement along here is 250 mil. So wall number 1 is 3 lots of 50 mil, so that was 150 millimeters. And wall number 2 was 4 lots of 50 millimeters. So that was 200 mil. And so that meant this one, if it was square, this would be 5 units of measure, so 5 lots of 50 mil, 250 mil, which it was. So 3, 4, 5 rule. Simple thing to remember when you are measuring out large distances and you want to make sure a large area is square. Let's give an example. Let's say we've got a wall here, and this is 3 meters, 4 meters, and this diagonal should be 5 meters if the 3, 4, 5 rule is correct. But let's say you measured the diagonal from this point to this point, you measured 5 meters and it stopped short of that point. You would know that these 2 walls are splayed open. They are not at 90 degrees, they're greater than 90 degrees. Or if you measured the 3 meters out and put a mark, and 4 meters out, put a mark, and then the 5 meter and it came past, you'd know that these 2 walls were actually not quite 90 degrees to one another. It was under square. So hopefully you can understand that. Hopefully I've explained it clearly enough so that you can use 3 lots of meters, or you can use 3, if it's a 10 meter area, you can go 3 lots of 3 meters, which is 9 meters, 4 lots of 3 meters, which is 12 meters, and then 5 lots of 3 meters, 5 threes are 15 meters. So you can apply this rule to as big an area as you want. So hopefully will help you out when you're planning things out pouring a slab for a barbecue area, entertaining area, things like that. Okay, thanks for watching. If you've liked this and appreciated this, please click like below, and please feel free to comment, and we really appreciate you following our channel. See you next time.